is about the opening opposition team in a British parliamentary debate, and not only what their role is in the debate and what they should be doing, but also some strategies that you might want to employ when you're in that position on the table. I want to begin, though, by giving you a bit of my own background, because hopefully this will explain where I'm coming from, and this might be helpful to you. I started debating in the Canadian parliamentary style of debate, which is quite similar to American parliamentary. It only has two teams. There's just a government proposition team and an opposition team. And there's sort of a similar emphasis in Canadian parliamentary on practical concerns and feasibility concerns. After debating and studying in Canada, I went to study and debate in the UK, which, for very obvious reasons, employs the British parliamentary style of debate. And so I, like yourselves, had to make a transition from a two-team practicality, sort of feasibility-emphasized format of debate to a four-team, more philosophically and principally oriented style of debate. And so I understand where you're coming from, and I know that it can be at times a difficult transition and sometimes hard to wrap your mind around it. And so I'm hoping that I can help you in that transition. And if you do have more questions about how to make that leap from American parliamentary to British parliamentary, I'm very happy to entertain them at the end, and hope that my experience can help you with that. But we're going to be focusing on the first opposition team for the next little bit. And so, because I love signposting, what we're going to be doing in this presentation is doing a brief review of hopefully what we've all learned so far, then talking a bit about the role of the team as a whole, then some strategic considerations you're going to want to have as an opening opposition team in every single debate, regardless of the topic or regardless of what happens. Thirdly, we're going to talk a bit about some strategic considerations that will hopefully never ever come up, ever. But this is something that Professor Steve Johnson talks about in his book. It's something that Josh talked about, and we've all talked about it so far. These are things that should never be happening in debate, but if, in the slight possibility that they do, you want to be ready for them. The fourth and fifth things we'll talk about will be the specific speaker roles. So what you want to be doing as the leader of the opposition, what you want to be doing as the deputy leader of the opposition, and finally, we'll have some questions. So hopefully we've learned these things so far. We've got our four teams. We've got our opening prop, which Josh just talked about eloquently. We're going to have our opening opposition. That constitutes our first half of the debate. And then we have a second half. We've got our closing prop. We have our closing op. These are things that everyone should know by now. If there's anything on this slide that is a surprise to you, I'm very worried for both myself and for you. We have two speakers on each team, 8 speeches, 7-minute speeches. This slide should take us 10 seconds. So what we're focusing on this morning is the first half of the debate. And to be honest, this should be the least painful part of your transition from American parliamentary to British parliamentary. Because in a lot of ways, despite all the new things we've been teaching you, the first half of a British parliamentary debate, in a lot of ways, should be resembling an American parliamentary debate. We have the first Prime Minister's speech, and in sort of very, very broad brushstrokes, your Prime Minister is going to have a model, and they're going to give you some arguments. The Leader of the Opposition is going to respond to those arguments and have some of their own. Your Deputy PM, as Josh has been telling you about, is going to respond to the Leader of the Opposition's arguments, have some new constructed material, have a split themselves, and hopefully have some time to reconstruct the Prime Minister's speech. And then, in, again, very broad brushstrokes, your Deputy Leader of the Opposition, who will be giving the last speech in the first half of the debate, will be rebutting the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, giving some new constructive analysis themselves, and hopefully, if time allows, reconstructing the Leader of the Opposition speech. We're going to be going into a great deal more detail about the LO speech and the Deputy LO speech, but I just want to put this all into context for you before we begin. So what is the role of the opening opposition team? Well, these again are very, very broad brushstrokes and broad principles, but the two main tasks of your opening opposition team are these. Firstly, you want to counter everything that comes out of the opening proposition in terms of their constructive material, their positive matter, their split, whatever you want to call it, the team line and the arguments that are brought to you by the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. So what you're doing as the opening opposition team, as it implies in the name, is you're opposing all of that material. But the second thing you want to do, and again, this can be a slight wrinkle from both American and Canadian parliamentary debate is that you have two tasks as the opposition. And this isn't necessarily implied in the name opening opposition. You're not just opposing the constructive matter brought to you by the opening government team, you are also constructing a positive case. And this is just as important as opposing the constructive material brought to you by the opening government. So you are building a case yourself. And the way that I like to think about this in British parliamentary is you almost want to imagine, when you are the opening opposition, that you are reversing the motion in your mind and you are the opening government. So flip the words in the motion, make them the opposite of what they are, and then build constructive arguments for that resolution. That's how I like to think about it, because judges in British parliamentary will be trained and will judge you in such a way that they will sometimes expect just as much constructive material from you as they expect from the opening government. And that's how you should treat your role. You have to bring in that analysis to the debate. And as it says under sort of the bullet points of number 2, you want to have this for a lot of reasons. But some of the reasons are that you want it to be very difficult for other people to rebut you, and you also want to make it difficult for your second team to have a lot of stuff to talk about. Now, you need to be wary of what Josh was talking about in terms of burning the turf. You don't want to try to think of every possible argument that you could make as the opening opposition and come up with 12 arguments, and you as the leader of the opposition will have 8 and your partner will have 4, and you'll spend about 20 seconds on each one. I guarantee none of those will be very good arguments because you just won't have enough time to analyze them and flesh them out. So you don't want to try to do that, but what you do want to do as the opening opposition, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on, is try to think of the most relevant and the most important arguments that are going to come out from the opening opposition, pick those strategically, and develop those really, really well. And in that way, you're going to put yourself in a strong position in the second half of the debate, when in a lot of ways, you've been shut out. And so these are the two main roles of the opening opposition. We always want to keep these in our mind because you'll sometimes see very good teams who will do one or the other of these very well and neglect the other one. And you have to be doing both if you wanted to get a first in this debate, which obviously I didn't do very well yesterday. So how do we do this? Again, this is very obvious, but we're going over the basics to make sure that everybody is on the same page today. We have two main tools as the opening opposition, as we do in any position on the table. We're rebutting and we're making arguments. This is obvious, but again, you would be surprised how many good teams will occasionally forget to do one of these things. You want to have a very clear portion of your speech that is a rebuttal portion of your speech, and you want to tell your judges that. When you're doing rebuttal, you want to say, I have 3 points of rebuttal. They are A, B, and C. I will now commence with A. And then you do A. I will now commence with B. And then you do B. I will now commence with C. And then you do C. And that's your rebuttal. And then you tell your judge, I have just completed 3 points of rebuttal. I'm now going to begin 2 points of constructive analysis that are Y and Z. And then you do those things. And at the very end of your speech, you remind your judge that you've done 5 things. You had 3 points of rebuttal, and you had 2 points of substantive analysis. This is very, very important because, as Josh reminded us this morning, your judges aren't necessarily dumb, but sometimes they're tired, sometimes they haven't had their coffee yet, sometimes they've just tuned out a little bit, and so you want to make sure that you are making their job as easy as possible for them and you're being crystal, crystal clear. So in terms of strategic considerations for any debate when we are in the opening opposition position on the table, and really when we're in any position on the table, Josh talked about this in terms of a team line. I call it taking a position. When you are the opening opposition, this is just as important as when you are the opening government. And sometimes people neglect this because we all know the opening government has to have a model. They need to sort of provide some clarity and interpret the motion, and they really need to set the grounds for the debate. Personally, when I am in the opening opposition, I think it's just as important to do that because you are doing the same thing for the opposition benches, not just for your team, but for the closing opposition as well. So you want to take a stance on the motion. You want to have a theme, a team line, a position, whatever you want to call it. You want to have a guiding philosophy that unifies all of your arguments and all of your analysis, and ideally, all of your rebuttal as well. And when I'm coaching teams for really any position in British parliamentary debate, I always tell them that it's important to be able to say your team line or your stance or your position in 1 or 2 concise sentences. You need to be able to articulate it very clearly so that at the end of the debate, when the judges haven't even heard from you for half an hour, the judge can say, when he or she is deliberating with the other judges, well, I remember the opening opposition, they were really great. Their team stood for freedom of choice. It should be that simple. They should be able to say in 1 or 2 sentences what it is that your philosophy was, what you stood for. And so I have a couple examples up here. The first one is the most obvious and the most common. You'll see opposition teams generally defending the status quo. This is easy, it's clear, and to be honest, if it's available to you, I often go for it as a team stance or a team position. We saw that in the debates the other day about banning smoking in China. A lot of the teams that we prepared with and that gave presentations, when they were the first opposition team, stood up and said, right now it's okay to smoke in China, we think that's fine, we're going to defend the status quo. And that's very clear. You can articulate that in 1 or 2 sentences. Everybody knows what you're talking about. There's other lines that you can take, though, and this all depends on the context of the debate, but it's possible to introduce a new proposal as the opposition. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. Generally, though, I would discourage teams from doing this because oftentimes this can lead to a debate where you are debating the relative merits of the government and the opposition's proposals, and you're not necessarily making arguments anymore, which is a major pitfall of this approach, but sometimes it's appropriate, and we'll discuss when that is. Sometimes you can stand for a new philosophical principle that maybe isn't the status quo, but is different than what the government is standing for, and that can be your opposition stance. Sometimes you can be almost entirely defensive in your stance or your philosophy, and you can focus on the flaws of the government's policy. Again, I think strategically this is a bit weaker because it is entirely a defensive approach. And as Josh said, with the opening government, you do want to be offensive in terms of being on the attack. I think that that philosophy is just as true for the opening opposition. Even though the name is opposition and you are opposing what the government's saying, I think you do want to be pushing back offensively as well with some sort of a position. And so my preference personally is for a very hearty defense of the status quo. That's always my preference. But again, there's some debates where that won't be appropriate, and your experience will teach you that. And as it says at the very bottom, you want to make sure that you can relate all of your arguments back to that position. A really clear and easy way of making sure that this is the case is that when you're preparing in that half hour with your partner and with your tutor, you want to look at all of your arguments, look at the team line that you've decided unifies everything you're saying, and make sure that all those arguments relate back to it. Can you, in one sentence, link the argument to the philosophy or to the stance? If you can, you're golden. If there's 1 or maybe 2 arguments that really don't chime with that philosophy or that stance, perhaps those strategically aren't the best choice for you. And again, I think we saw this yesterday in the demonstration debate. We had a topic about elevating access to the internet as a basic human right. And a lot of the arguments that I came up with in my speech, well, I thought they were pretty good arguments. Now that I think about them, didn't necessarily have all that much to do with the topic. And so that's important, right? You need to think about the arguments you've come up with, how they fit with the topic, and how they fit with your team's philosophy, and how your team's philosophy fits with the topic. All these things need to fit together. And so these are all the sorts of things we want to be thinking about before the debate even starts. And so the second thing we always should be thinking about in any debate as the opening opposition, and really as any team in the debate, is picking the quote-unquote right arguments, the most appropriate arguments. This is not to say that there are right arguments and there are wrong arguments. By right, I mean the best arguments strategically for you in the debate. So with any topic, we want to be thinking about what the most important, relevant, and interesting issues are going to be on that topic from your position on the table. And we want to be framing all of our arguments around those issues. You're obviously all very smart, you're intelligent, you can come up with arguments. And so the issue for all of you is not going to be the ability to generate arguments. The issue for all good debaters is being able to filter those and prioritize them and figuring out which of that massive arguments I've come up with are the best, most relevant, most interesting, most compelling arguments that relate to this topic. And that can be difficult to discern and is something that you'll be able to figure out with more experience and more practice of debating. But just to give you an example, in a debate about legalizing prostitution, if we're the opening opposition, there's a whole bunch of arguments that we could come up with, and I think one that might be popular with this crowd would be whether or not it would be possible to enforce a ban on prostitution. Now, that is certainly an argument that could be made, but what might be a more interesting argument to analyze, and might be a more principled philosophical argument that would fit in better in the context of a British parliamentary debate, would be about whether or not people can ever freely or fairly choose to become a prostitute. The reason I say that is because I think when you're the opposition to legalizing prostitution, you can reasonably anticipate that the proposition will be making arguments about women's or men's ability to choose to become a sex trade worker, that that is a choice that people should be allowed to make, and that governments should support individuals' choices. And so when you're thinking about that sort of an argument that the proposition is going to make, a natural response to that would be an analysis of that choice and a look at sort of the practical reality of individuals who do enter that line of work, and whether or not that is a choice that those people really freely and fairly have chosen to make. And the conclusion of your argument would be, well, no, they haven't actually, and if they had been given more opportunities and more choices, maybe they would have chosen a different line of work or a different lifestyle for themselves. And so that is probably going to be a more philosophically and principally interesting argument than one about whether or not a government could entirely enforce a ban on prostitution. And so that is what I mean when I say picking the right arguments. And I hope that you are getting the impression after this many talks that we really do want you to be making those sorts of philosophical arguments, those principled arguments. That's not to say that we entirely ignore practicality, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes, but that really is the emphasis in this style of debate. Another reason for that is because we do have 8 speakers in a British parliamentary debate. There are 4 teams. And in order to sustain an hour of British parliamentary debate, oftentimes practical arguments are not going to be enough. If you stand up as the first speaker for the opposition, you're the leader of the opposition, and you say, Mr. Speaker, this just isn't going to work. We don't have the money, we don't have the police force, we don't have the political will, you can't do it. Well, if that's true, that's the end of the debate. And there are 6 more speeches that are meant to happen in that debate. And it's not very interesting, it becomes quite repetitive, your judge might actually fall asleep. What you do want to do is make those interesting philosophical arguments that it's possible to take many different perspectives on, it's possible to give that depth of analysis. That will make the debate more interesting, and if you want to be Machiavellian about it, that will give you higher speaker scores, to be honest. So really focus on that. The third thing we want to consider, particularly in the front half of the debate, and Josh talked about this as well, is staying relevant. Because again, we have 4 teams. Halfway through this debate, as the opening opposition, you do not have the opportunity to make any more speeches. When your deputy leader of the opposition sits down, there are 4 more speeches, and none of those belong to either of the opening teams. So how do you stay in it? Because for those of you that have judged, and for myself, I think there is a natural human tendency to want to favor the most recent things that you've heard. And as a judge, you really have to do a lot of legwork to make sure that you try to do your best to give the credit that you want to the front half of the debate, even though you've just had, how many minutes? 28 minutes of back half debate, and it's fresh in your mind and you thought it was really good, and you're doing your darndest to remember the front half. When you're in the front half, when you're the opening opposition, how do you make sure the judge does that for you? Well, the first bullet point is hopefully something that will apply to everyone. Hopefully you'll have had really awesome arguments. Hopefully those will have been interesting. You'll have taken that hard line that Josh was talking about. You will have made those interesting philosophical arguments that really challenge the way people think. You've really taken the analysis to another level. But the real way that we're going to do that, beyond having all those amazing arguments, because I'm going to assume as a baseline everyone will do the first thing, the second thing is points of information. And everybody has talked about this so far, but the reason we've all talked about this is because these are really, really going to save you when you are in the front half of a British parliamentary debate. In a lot of ways, I think it's an advantage to be opening opposition. You do get a first crack at the government's case. You do get to make those most obvious, most interesting opposition arguments. But the obvious disadvantage of opening opposition is you can be shut out of the second half of the debate. And so for that reason, points of information, as I put up there, obviously are not optional for you. You have to get up. I put there that you should offer at least 4 per speech in the second half. To be honest, I don't know why I chose 4. I tend to agree with Josh. You should really get up as much as possible without barracking the speaker. And by barracking the speaker, I mean being so annoying that you're driving the speaker nuts and you're clearly bothering the chair and the judge. This is something that's hard to put a number to because it will always depend on the context of the debate. Sometimes you will be in a very, very high level debate, maybe in the top room at the tournament, and you know all the other teams, you know your judge, you know your chair, everybody's been debating for years, and you know that your opposition team can really take it if you're offering them a lot of questions. It's not going to throw them off, it won't bother them. And then maybe in that case it's appropriate for you to offer 8 points of information in their speech, or 9, or 10. Maybe you're in a room where one of the teams is brand new and this is their first debate. You don't necessarily know all the teams, you don't know your judge, and maybe one of the speakers is very nervous. In that debate, it would not be appropriate for you to get up 8, 9, or 10 times and loudly yell point of information in the middle of their speech. So you have to read the room and you have to figure out what's going to be appropriate in the context of that debate. But that having been said, in the second half of the debate, as the opening opposition, you want to get up as much as you can without pushing that envelope. And as Josh said before, you want to be focusing your points of information, not on nitpicky details, not on things that don't necessarily relate to the crucial parts of your analysis. You really want to focus on your team line, on your position, on your theme as the opening opposition, and you want to force that closing government team to talk about your issues. Hopefully, because of the first thing, because of the weight of your arguments and your analysis, the closing government will be talking about you anyway, because they'll have identified that you're a real threat in the debate. They think that maybe you guys might take the first, and so strategically, they'll be rebutting you and they'll be talking about you a lot. But if they're not, you want to get up a lot and try to force them to do that. So ask questions about your team line, ask them questions about your best argument, show them where the clash lies between what you're saying and what they're saying, and force them to make you relevant again. So now we get to the part of my talk where hopefully these slides will never be relevant to you and you will never have to do any of these things. But for those of you, and it seems like there's a lot of you who've read Steve's book, this is something that Steve talks about a great deal as well with regards to the opening opposition. Because it seems to be a very big concern for debaters who are new to British parliamentary debate, or really to any style of debate, with regards to the first couple opposition speeches. And to be honest, I don't really understand why, because in my experience of debate over the last 14 years, this has only ever come up for me twice over literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of debates. But people are fixated on it, so I'm going to talk about it. And the big takeaway, if you remember anything from my talk, is you should never do this. Just never do it. Just don't do it. We're going to talk about it, because hopefully that will make everybody feel calmer and more comfortable about it. But just never, ever do this. If we all have fair and reasonable definitions, then this shouldn't be a problem. But we have to talk about it because it makes people feel better. So definitional challenges. Josh talked about this really well, so I luckily don't have to go into a great amount of detail. But there are a very, very, very limited number of circumstances or situations in which it is appropriate for an opening opposition team to directly challenge the opening government's definition or model for the debate, and to replace it with a more appropriate one, and to insist that the debate continues on those new grounds or new model. And so Josh talked to us a bit about what happens when a prime minister introduces a model that is a squirrel. So he gave us that example of a motion about celebrity criminals being given higher punishments, and the government team defining that as Saddam Hussein getting the death penalty. The essence of the squirrel being that what the model is really does not have much to do with the spirit of the resolution. So that's the focus of the squirrel. A truism is something that proves itself. So an example of a truism that I encountered years ago was a debate about military intervention in foreign countries, and the government defined the circumstances under which military intervention would be justified as circumstances so bad that military intervention would be justified, right? So the definition or the model or the interpretation of the resolution proves the resolution itself. Effectively, the Prime Minister, had they wanted to, could have sat down, because you don't need any arguments to support that. Your definition proves the resolution. That is a truistic model. We can have unreasonable time or place settings. So We can have a debate that is about, introducing a carbon tax, and a particularly terrible opening government team, because they were writing their PhDs on Azerbaijan, could set the debate in Azerbaijan, and maybe this debate's happening in California. That would not be an appropriate place setting of the debate, given the fact that it's just a sneaky thing to do that really doesn't have much to do with the spirit of the motion. Unreasonable time settings, like Josh talked about, if we have debates happening 300 years in the past that ought not to be happening there, like debates about the state of Iraq and whether or not we should be splitting it into 3 parts, that would be an unreasonable time setting. And the final one is just this sort of general catch-all category of really bad models, are those that are otherwise unarguable. And an example that I would give of this was, very recently I was coaching a high school debate team, and we were having a debate about whether or not all countries have the right to possess nuclear weapons. And this was a prepared debate. My kids have been prepping it for about a month. And we get to the tournament, and my kids are the opening opposition, and the opening government gets up and says, we think that all countries have the right to possess nuclear weapons. Our model, Madam Speaker, is that countries that are democratic have a right to possess nuclear weapons. Now, because my kids were so desperate to avoid a definitional challenge, they debated the debate on those grounds, and they won the debate. But that would have been an appropriate situation for the leader of the opposition to stand up and say, Madam Speaker, the motion before the House is all countries have the right to possess nuclear weapons. The opening government has defined this as democratic countries. There are more countries in the world than democratic countries. There are many non-democratic countries. The spirit of this resolution is all countries, and so we are challenging the opening government's definition, and we are replacing it with one that would include all countries in the world, as the motion sets out. That would have been an appropriate definitional challenge, and would have been one that the judges would have been fine with. So you need to keep that in mind. These are the situations in which a definitional challenge will be acceptable. So what we want to do in this situation that will hopefully never arise for you is that you should explain, firstly, the problem with the Prime Minister's model. Explain the issue. Why is there a problem with the definition that's been given to you by the first opening speaker? Secondly, as the leader of the opposition, we want to redefine the motion. So we want to say, Mr. Speaker, the replacement definition that we're going to give for this debate is that all countries, and by all countries we mean every country in the world, regardless of their government structure, has the right to possess nuclear weapons. Now, when we are redefining the motion, as the leader of the opposition, that first speaker in opening opposition, we want to do what Josh was talking about before, and think about what will make the best debate possible. We don't want to be sneaky, we don't want to be slimy, we don't want to pick a definition that's advantageous to us as the opening opposition team. We want to pick the definition that the people who wrote the motion had in mind when they chose that motion. That's always what you want to be thinking about as the opening government team, and if in a situation this scenario arises, the opening opposition team, what was the debate that we were supposed to have? Why are we talking about this at all? Chief adjudicators and people who write resolutions are never writing them to trick you, and there's never like a hidden meaning in those motions. They will set a topic to be as clear as possible, and they want you to debate it in the way that it is most obviously interpreted. So the obvious example of this is the practice debate we had yesterday about banning smoking in China. If we wanted you to talk about public places, we would have put that in the motion. The topic was ban smoking in China because we wanted you to talk about banning smoking in China, everywhere in China, no smoking, right? So think about the topic, look at the words that have been used, look at the words that aren't in the motion, and then define it that way. That's what we want to think about as the opening government and as the opening opposition if you are in the very unfortunate situation of having to redefine. The final thing you do after having explained the problems with the definition as presented and having redefined is debate the debate on those new grounds. Establish that new interpretation and that new model, and then proceed to make your argument on those grounds. This is always, 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 always a last resort. As Steve mentioned yesterday, when we had that debate about banning smoking in China, and a lot of teams chose to define the topic as banning smoking in public places, A good opposition strategy in that situation would not be to challenge the definition, would not be to redefine it, but would be to debate it on the grounds as presented by the government and banning smoking just in public places. Because as Steve explained, from a strategic perspective as the opening opposition, your job becomes a whole hell of a lot easier. Because all the arguments that the opening government is making about the health benefits of banning smoking and the fact that there's going to be less secondhand smoke, so all these innocent people are going to be exposed to carcinogens, completely collapse in on themselves when you only ban smoking in one area of society, and you very likely increase the incidence of smoking in private places. So, as the opening opposition, you really want to think about the definition that's been provided to you and what the implications of that definition are for the arguments of the government and for your arguments. If the definition provided by the government makes your life way easier and makes your rebuttal way easier and puts you in a strong position to win the debate, and if you can prove that in your first speech, your judge will be very happy and you'll probably win the debate. The major, major danger of a definitional challenge, and I didn't put this on the slide, but I really hope it's self-evident, is that you will have a debate about definitions. And this is the worst possible debate in the world, a debate in which it really doesn't matter if you take the first, because everybody's speaker scores will be so low you won't break at the tournament. And this is often what happens in definitional challenge debates. The government will define something, the opposition will stand up and challenge it, and then the deputy prime minister will stand up and defend their partner's definition and challenge the opposition's definition, and then the deputy member of the deputy leader of the opposition will stand up and re-defend his partner's definition and re-attack the government's definition. Hopefully that will all be dropped in the second half and there'll be a better debate, and the second half will take the first and the second, and you guys in the front half will take a very low third and fourth. Try to avoid this at all possible costs. Really only challenge and redefine the motion if the debate absolutely requires it and you cannot debate on the grounds presented by your opening government. If there is still some scope for debate, please by all means go ahead and debate it. And don't do it. So the second thing that hopefully will never happen, but again must be talked about because it did happen in the grand final of the World Universities Debating Championships in 2007 and made for a terrible debate, is counter propositions. This is the situation in which the Prime Minister, so the first speaker of the opening government, introduces a completely legitimate model or interpretation of the motion, and you as the leader of the opposition decide strategically that the best thing for you to do in the debate would be to counter that by proposing a different model. And this is a counter proposition. I never do this because I think it's terrible, but it happens sometimes, so you need to be prepared for it. But again, I would suggest strongly that you don't. Almost so similarly to a definitional challenge, but differently because you're not challenging the model, you're giving the House a different way of fixing the same problem. So what you want to do, if you are going to do this, don't do this, but if you are, you want to explain the issues with the proposal that has been forwarded by the Prime Minister, and you want to introduce a counter-proposal. And you want to do two things with your counter-proposal, and these are very, very important. You want to explain why your counter-proposal is mutually exclusive. What I mean by this is you want to explain why you can't do the proposal that's been forwarded by the opening government and the proposal that you're forwarding at the same time. They're necessarily exclusive of one another, and you can only do one or the other. You can't do both. The reason that this is important is because if they are not mutually exclusive, if they're things that you can do together, then you open yourself up to the Deputy Prime Minister standing up and saying, that's all well and good, we think that's fine, we'll do that too. And then all of your analysis falls out of the debate, or is brought under the wing of the government's analysis. The second thing you want to do is you want to explain why your proposal is better. And this is obviously very important as well. You have to have a reason for coming up with a counter-proposal, and that reason should be that your proposal achieves its ends better than the government's proposal says that it achieves its ends. So what's an example of this? Well, one that I saw that was a counter-proposal, and again, I don't like counter-proposals, but this is one that works. there was a debate about having capital punishment for sex offenders. And so the government was proposing, obviously, that you should have the death penalty for people who are convicted of very serious sexual offenses. And the leader of the opposition got up and said, "We also dislike sex offenders. We think that they're terrible people, but we wouldn't kill them, Mr. Speaker. We would chemically castrate them." Now that is obviously a mutually exclusive proposal, because you can't chemically castrate dead people. So the opposition is proposing that we keep these people alive, but that we punish them in a different sort of way. And so that's a mutually exclusive proposal. And then they had a variety of reasons as to why they thought this was a better proposal, because they thought that while these people certainly had to be punished for what they had done, that there was a possibility of rehabilitation if they were altered in a very physical way. And so there was this different proposal that was brought out by the opposition team. The good thing about that counter proposal was that the debate did not become entirely focused on the proposals, but was focused on the principles and the philosophies underlying the proposals. So the debate became about whether or not we could give these sorts of people second chances, and it wasn't necessarily a debate about the relative merits or demerits of the two proposals. That is very, very rare, though. The vast majority of debates about proposals and counter-proposals often become about about the slight differences between the two, and that is the big danger of counter-propositions. And that is why I say at the very bottom that this is always nearly a last resort, and is something that I think you should avoid. It is also something that doesn't always fit very well with the style and ethos of British parliamentary debate. As I've been saying all along, British parliamentary debate is much more focused on philosophy and principles, and much less worried about implementation and sort of questions of policy. And so for that reason, you see this much, much less in British parliamentary debate than you would in American parliamentary or Canadian parliamentary debate. And so for that reason, I'm sort of questioning why I even brought it up. But it's something that I think you should know about, because it will happen if you go to international tournaments. You might come across this. But again, the big takeaway from this is please don't do it. So finally, to get specifically to the roles of the speakers. Very broad brushstrokes here, but what we want to be doing as the leader of the opposition, the first opposition speaker, is we want to be setting out the opposition to the motion. And as Logan was saying yesterday, an important role of that first speaker is to set out the clash for the debate. At the very beginning of your speech as the leader of the opposition, you want to tell everyone in the debate, including the judge, explicitly, at the end of the debate, what are going to be the two big values that we were talking about? If you can identify those at the very beginning of the opposition's case, the first speech for all the opposition speakers, that puts you in a very strong position to stay relevant for the whole 1 hour of this sort of monstrously long British parliamentary debate. By telling your judge, this is a clash of X and Y. We stand for Y, and at the end of the debate, that's going to be the issue that means that we win this debate. So you want to set that out. Specifically, as we've been saying all along, what this speaker wants to be doing is to be countering what we've heard from the Prime Minister constructively, and to begin to construct the opening opposition's line or case. So if you want a checklist, if this is something that makes you more comfortable, this is what I would at least expect to see in a leader of the opposition speech. As Logan said yesterday, everything that I am telling you and everything that all of the other people presenters have been saying to you are guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules. And so if there is a speech that you give as a leader of the opposition that does not have all of these elements, or has extra elements that I haven't thought of, that does not mean that you are doing anything wrong. These are suggestions that I have come up with based on my experience, but they are only suggestions. And so do not follow them to a T if you don't think that they're appropriate in a given debate, and don't worry about it. But as guidelines, these are the sorts of things generally I would expect to see. The first one is hopefully, again, something that we will never see, but if it does come up and there is a definitional challenge, people have said this before and I'll say it again, the only appropriate time to bring it up is at the very beginning of the leader of the opposition speech. You will never, well, you should never have a definitional challenge coming out of the second speech in the opening opposition, and you really shouldn't be having it coming out in the second half of the debate. If there is going to be one, it has to be right at the start of that first speech. One of the many reasons for that is that it's not fair to the other side if you decide to bring out a definitional challenge at the end of your speech, or if you decide to allocate it to the deputy leader of the opposition speech. If you are going to fundamentally alter the grounds of the debate, in fairness to everyone, you should do that as soon as possible so that everybody has as much time as possible to prepare and to continue the debate on those new grounds. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the rebuttal of the Prime Minister's speech. Again, the order in which we do our rebuttal and our constructive is more flexible in British parliamentary debate. My personal preference is to get rebuttal out of the way first. I know a lot of other debaters like to get their constructive out first. I don't particularly care in what order you do these things. The important thing is that you do both your rebuttal and your constructive. So rebut the Prime Minister's speech. If you don't have time to rebut everything, that's fine. Focus on the most important things the Prime Minister said. And if you are going to allocate things to your partner, indicate that to your judge so that your judge doesn't think you haven't noticed things. The third thing we want to do is introduce our opening opposition's position or theme or team line. That's something that should, again, take 1 or 2 sentences, but is very integral to establishing the clash and establishing what you guys are going to be standing for as a team. The fourth thing is that we want to announce the team split. And this is very important. This goes back to this idea of making the judge's life as easy as possible. You want to tell your judge not just what you're going to bring to the debate constructively, but what your partner will bring as well. Because the judge is going to be looking at how you two work together as a team, and a very, very easy way of getting full marks for teamwork is by doing this sort of signposting of the team split. Telling your judge, I'm going to have 2 constructive arguments, they are X and Y. My partner will have 2 further arguments, they are A and B. And then when your partner stands up, hopefully, they will actually present A and B. And then your judge will be happy and give you full marks for teamwork. So just do it. It's really easy and it takes 20 seconds. The final and most important thing that we're doing as the first speaker, the leader of the opposition, is having substantive arguments. My personal preference is to have at least 2. But as we heard before, this again is a guideline, it's not a hard and fast rule. There's going to be some debates, like maybe the smoking debate, where there will be one argument that will just be a super important argument. And maybe strategically you decide in the context of that debate that you are going to spend 4 or I don't know, even 5 minutes analyzing the heck of this one idea. And maybe that's fine. Generally speaking, you're probably going to want to have 2. I would be wary as an opening opposition speaker of having more than 3 arguments, just because I have yet to see a debater who can analyze more than 3 arguments in a 7-minute opening opposition speech very well. So try not to have too many. But as we've been talking about before as well, when we're preparing and we're coming up with our arguments as a team, we want to make sure strategically that we're prioritizing our arguments. So we have those really crucial, most important arguments in the leader of the opposition speech. And again, this was something that I did particularly badly yesterday in the demonstration debate. There was an important argument that my partner Shako had in her speech about human rights that should have been in my speech as the leader of the opposition. And that's something that you need to anticipate in the prep room. And you need to think, what are the most important initial arguments that are really doing a lot of offensive attacking work for us as the opening opposition? And make sure those really come out of the first speech. So what are we doing in the second speech? What is the deputy doing? Well, obviously, they're continuing all the good work that hopefully our leader of the opposition has begun for the team. Specifically, they are continuing to counter the opening proposition case with lots of really good, meaty rebuttal. They're continuing to construct, so we want to have new substantive ideas coming out of this speech as well. And in an ideal world, they're also reconstructing. They're looking at the rebuttal that has come out of the Deputy Prime Minister's speech of the Leader of the Opposition's substantive arguments, and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition is going to be reconstructing their partner's arguments and showing why that rebuttal really wasn't as damaging as the opening opposition led us all to believe. So in terms of a checklist, again, here are the 5 sort of guidelines or things that we would hope to see in this speech that's existing in a vacuum. Again, we want to be having rebuttal. This is crucial. As in almost any speech in a BP debate, we want to have rebuttal of the speech that's come before, But also, and this isn't on the slide, if, as often happens, the leader of the opposition doesn't have enough time to rebut everything that came out of the Prime Minister's speech, you want to make sure that as a deputy, you're doing that cleanup work, you're doing that maintenance for your partner. So you're not only attacking everything that's come out of the second speech from the opening government, but you're also cleaning up all the loose ends that your partner might not have had an opportunity to clean up. So you're attacking the remaining ideas that have come out of the Prime Minister's speech. So ideally, by the end of the rebuttal of the deputy leader of the opposition speech, everything introduced by the opening government, in terms of constructive matter, should have all been rebutted by your team. Then you want to reiterate your stance, your team line, your position as a team. And thirdly, you want to be introducing at least one new idea. Usually one new idea is going to be enough. There might be more debates where maybe you've come up with tons of stuff and actually it's appropriate for you to have two arguments. As a second speaker for the opening opposition team, I would be cautious about having more than two new substantive arguments. There's a lot of work that you have to do as a second speaker. The most important things will have been said by your partner. There might be a couple new interesting ideas, but more than two is probably not appropriate, and you can't really do more than two arguments well in this second speech. Number 4, I have if time allows, reconstruct. In an ideal world, we're going to have enough time. Number 4 is going to become much more important if your opening government is very good. So if the Deputy Prime Minister has gotten up and done some real damage to your case, number 4 is going to become quite important. You might actually want to move it up the list. You might want to have it after your rebuttal. It might become something that you integrate with your rebuttal. You might do your rebuttal and your reconstruction together. But no matter how you choose to do it, the important takeaway from this is that you want to be very clear about what you're doing while you're doing it. So tell your judge when you're doing rebuttal, I am now rebutting this argument that was brought up by the Deputy Prime Minister. When you're doing your reconstruction, tell your judge, my partner had this really great argument about A. The Deputy Prime Minister responded to it with B, C, and D, but look, here are 3 reasons why those things aren't actually as hard-hitting as he said they were. Be very clear about what you're doing. Once you've done that reconstruction, finally, the last thing we want to be doing is we want to be summarizing the opening half of the debate. And I think this was something that Logan brought up the other day, that you want to sort of paint a picture and do a very, very brief overview of what's happened. Because this is the last speech of the opening half. You want to give the impression at the end of that front half of the debate that you've really won the first half of the debate and set yourself up in a strong way for the second half of the debate. So these next 2 slides are my last slides. They're just a quick recap. It's everything we've talked about so far. We talked about the role of the team, things we want to consider in all debates, things that we want to consider in some debates that will hopefully never come up, and then finally we talked specifically about the speeches, what we want to be doing in each one of them. That's the end. As with Josh, I talked way more than I thought I was going to, but I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So there's already lots of hands. I'm going to let Steve choose.
Well, thanks for your speech, and I have a question about what you have just said, that that the leader of the opposition should rebuttal on the best arguments that give by the proposition, the leader of the proposition. But I think that is it proper that the best argument must be, is the best argument of the proposition, and if we argue on these arguments, there will be more disadvantages for the opposition than advantages. So I don't know how to debate on the best argument.
Sure, no, thanks. That's a good question. I've come across this question before. I think a lot of debaters who are starting out often have the impression that strategically it makes more sense for them to rebut the bad arguments of the other team because they know they can rebut them really well and they can really take them out of the debate. And while you don't want to be leaving arguments unresponded to, strategically, as somebody who's judged a lot, you are going to give teams much more credit for attempting to tackle the best arguments in the debate. Even if you aren't able to entirely win those arguments or take them out of the debate or neutralize them, your judge will give you more credit for identifying the most important arguments that the other team has made and attempting to deal with them. You are going to get much less credit for tackling the sort of nitpicky, less significant ideas. And so I know there's this natural tendency to want to deal with those easy things, but really try to get at the hardest issues and analyze those, particularly in the first half of the debate. Because at the end of the debate, those will be the arguments. If everybody's a good debater, those will be the arguments that are still being talked about, and the judge will remember that at the very start of the debate, as a leader of the opposition, you were trying to talk about those issues, that you were relevant right from the start. So do your best to focus on those issues. I know it's hard, but that's how you're going to win the debate, is not by picking the easy arguments. Pick the hard arguments and the really good arguments, and try to respond to those.
Well, thank you for your excellent speech. I think that's just brilliant. And I want to ask you one question about the spirit. Well, after yesterday's demonstration debating, I asked some debaters about the risk of the split you just mentioned, since that if the leader of the opposition mentions something that, well, the rest of the point will be issued by my second speaker, my partner, and there is a potential risk that your opponent might do the rebuttal before your partner actually begin that kind of constructive speech. So what do you consider would be the risk would be?
Sure. No, I think that is a real concern. I think you have to walk a very fine line. My personal preference, and people disagree on this, but my personal preference is for giving that signposting in the first speech to give an indication of not just what you're going to say, but what your partner is going to say as well. That having been said, you shouldn't be giving such a good idea of what your partner is going to say that you let the cat out of the bag. So you shouldn't be giving the argument for them before they give it. You literally just need to have one sentence for each argument they're going to give. So you can say something like, my partner will have two arguments. One of those will be analyzing the concept of human rights, and one of those will be talking about the nature of the internet. Now, I don't think either of those signposts or those flags give anybody enough of an idea of what my partner is going to talk about so that they can sufficiently rebut that idea before she's able to say it. You don't want your signpost to be so vague that it's meaningless, but you don't want to go into a lot of detail. So just a really quick indication that your partner is going to have some stuff to say and showing the judge that you guys are working together, but really don't go into that detail, and then I think generally you'll be fine.
Hi Jess, you mentioned the team split in your...
Sorry, can you put your hand up? I don't know where you are. Oh, there you are.
You mentioned the team split in your speech, and I want to ask some specific methods how we can announce the team split.
So you mean in terms of sort of signposting or telling your judge what you're going to say?
Some more specific methods or techniques.
Sure, okay, so does anyone know what I mean when I say signposting? Some people do, some people don't. Doesn't really make any sense. The idea of signposting is that when you're driving, say on the highway, and I'm going to give you a Canadian example because that's where I'm from. If I'm in Winnipeg and I'm driving to Toronto, there's going to be signs on the highway that say Thunder Bay 200 kilometers, Toronto 400 kilometers, Montreal 600 kilometers. That's not geographically accurate, but the sign is telling you what is coming up and how far away those things are. And in the way that signs do that, or like if you go to a restaurant and there's a menu, it's like, what am I going to have for my starter? What am I going to have for my entree? What am I going to have for my dessert? This is giving you an idea of what's coming up. In the way that menus or signposts do that, that's what we're doing at the beginning of our speech as the leader of the opposition, or really in any speech in a debate. We're giving an indication to our opponents or to our judge what it is that we're going to do in our speech. So at the beginning of my leader of the opposition speech, if I go back to that slide, my signpost might look something like this. Madam Speaker, I am going to do 5 things in this speech. I am firstly going to challenge the definition of the opening up government and provide an alternative definition that will hopefully be the definition for this debate. Secondly, I'm going to rebut 3 things that came out in the Prime Minister's speech. Thirdly, I'm going to give you our team split and our philosophy. And then fourthly and fifthly, I'm going to have 2 arguments, right? So I'm just telling you very, very quickly in one sentence what it is I'm going to do. Where it says the team split at number 4, that's another signposting opportunity. So I'm going to say, Madam Speaker, as a team, we want to accomplish 4 things substantively. I'm going to have an argument about rights. I'm going to have an argument about the internet. My partner's going to talk to you about cats, and then she's going to talk to you about dogs. And that's what we're going to do. Now, obviously, that is a fake team split. It would be really bad. But in one sentence, you're just telling the judge what it is you're going to do. It's not rocket science. It's really easy. I've seen a lot of you do it already the other day. A bunch of you were doing this in our practice debate. So I don't think this will be a challenge for any of you. But just do it. It's easy.
Thank you. Well, Jess, I've got a question for you. I have such kind of experience that when I was acting as the leader of opposition, that when the Prime Minister gave out a definition and what he or her defined was actually something different from that I have prepared. But he or her wasn't, narrowing down or actually have a wrong definition. So as an LO, how to, to have a quick react to and establish and shift your attention and have some other preparation.
Yeah, this is a really, really excellent question. And I'm sorry I didn't talk about this before, because I think this is probably one of the most important things about the Leader of the Opposition speech. I think Logan said this yesterday. It is probably the speech in a debate that you have to be the most flexible in. Because as you say, we will give you resolutions that are clear and simple, but oftentimes there are multiple reasonable ways of interpreting that resolution. And as the opening opposition team, you don't necessarily know, you don't know what your opening government is going to do. And so you need to, in your half-hour preparation with your partner and with your tutor, prepare knowing that. So come up with a variety of ways of opposing the motion. Think to yourself, if we were the opening government, how might we define this? Or how might we interpret this? And think about all the possible reasonable ways of interpreting that, what those arguments might look like as the opening government, and then conversely, how you would respond to those different possible interpretations of the resolution. And this is something I think Sean and I might talk about a little later on today, about extensions. You take a similar approach in the back half of the debate, because you don't necessarily know what's going to happen with both opening teams. You don't know what they're going to say, and you still want to have something that you can say as an extension speaker. So you want to prepare for the widest possible variety of circumstances. So as the Leader of the Opposition, when you're listening to the Prime Minister's speech, you want to listen very closely to what they say, what their interpretation of the resolution is, what their arguments are, and then look at your sheet of arguments that you prepared and identify which of those most closely counters what the Prime Minister is saying. If nothing you've prepared fits in that debate, and I know this is tricky, what you have to do is throw out your sheet and come up with new arguments during the Prime Minister's speech. It is much worse for you to stick to what you prepared in a debate where what you have prepared is entirely irrelevant. It's much better for you to attempt to be relevant and to make arguments that directly respond to what the Prime Minister is saying. This is like what we were talking about before with tackling the best arguments and trying to do that as opposed to sort of creaming the worst arguments. Your judge will give you credit for attempting to be relevant and for rolling with the punches in the debate and being flexible. So I know it's scary, but try to do that.
Thank you. And my question is also about definitional challenge. Mm-hmm. And the first speaker of the debate, the Prime Minister, has made a framework. That is the definition. And according to the rule, everything should be discussed under this framework. But if the opposition leader challenges this definition, so the framework has changed. So what will be the framework for the rest of the 6 speakers?
Yeah, very good question. So this question is why everyone that I know suggests that we don't do definitional challenges, because the big issue with them, as I was saying before, is that if as the leader of the opposition you decide it's appropriate to challenge the definition and redefine, and then you make all of your arguments based on your interpretation of the motion, it is very possible and oftentimes likely that the Deputy Prime Minister will get up and not accept your challenge and will debate based on the Prime Minister's definition. And then your partner is going to get up and continue the debate on the basis of your definition, and what we have is a debate where we have like two ships passing in the night that aren't actually interacting and there's no clash. In that situation, it's going to be up to the judge to assess whether or not the judge thought that the definition provided by the opening government was reasonable, or whether or not the challenge by the opening opposition and redefinition was reasonable. But as I was saying before, if that happens and you have a government that won't accept a challenge and an opposition that has decided to make a challenge, regardless of what the judge thinks, you're going to have a bad debate because the teams aren't engaging, there's no clash, and so everybody's going to suffer, regardless of your position. Whether or not you get a third or a second or even a first, everybody's speaker points are going to be low and it's going to be a bad debate. So the big takeaway about definitional challenges is don't do them for the reason that you bring up.
Thanks, Jess. This question is also about team split. Well, I want to confirm what my understanding is right or wrong. You said that you just give signposts for team split as opposition leaders, right? But I think the more this question is for Steve, because in his book he said in opening proposition you are not supposed to announce your team split because you don't know what's going to happen in probably 14 minutes. Is that what you meant? Do you want to answer this, Steve?
Steve?
You need to be comfortable with ambiguity. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Debate is about being comfortable with uncertainty. Sometimes it's a good idea to announce a team split. Sometimes it's a terrible idea to announce a team split. What you have to be comfortable with is knowing when those times are right or wrong. So there's no absolute answer that I can give you. Personally, I prefer that you not lock yourself into something that won't happen for another 14 or 21 minutes in the debate. Jess sees advantages to having a team split and announcing it early. I think we're both right in certain ways.
This comes back to the guidelines thing. I know it's uncomfortable when you're trying to learn something new, that we can't tell you anything that's always true and always right, but that's debating. Like, there's always situations where things will be appropriate and things won't be appropriate, and so these are purely guidelines.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I see it as personal opinions, probably some of them are standard that you have to follow, and some of them are just your suggestions or your advice from your years of experience as debaters, right?
Yeah, I mean, and again, this all becomes easier the more debating that you do. The more you see lots and lots of different debates and debate in them and judge them, you'll learn more and more what is appropriate in a given context, and everything changes depending on what debate you're having.
Okay, my second question, I'm sorry, I'm sneaking in another question. Josh said that as opening proposition, you need to, well, it's better for you to challenge the status quo. And while you are saying that for the opposition leaders, it's better for you to maintain this status quo, to defend the status quo. But I think it's depending on the content of your motion, right? It's not fixed suggestion whether you challenge or defend your status quo, right?
Absolutely. Okay. So the only reason I say that is because typically the way motions tend to be phrased are that a motion is going to be a change. It's going to be something new. Almost by definition, it will be a proposal. And so the government will have to propose something different and new. And so in a lot of debates, but certainly not all of them, a natural position for your opening opposition is going to be a defense of the way things are. But sometimes you won't want to do that. Maybe the way things are really awful and you want to defend something else. And so that's fine. You can come up with a counter-proposal, or you can purely attack the particular proposal being forwarded by the government. But you'll see in a lot of debates, the way that these things tend to be phrased is that the opposition very comfortably can defend the status quo, but certainly not in all debates.
Okay, sometimes they have to challenge status quo. Right? Thanks.
Thanks, Jess, for your wonderful speech.
You're welcome.
Actually, I've got two questions. The first one is that, as the deputy leader, what should we do if the leader of the opposition didn't answer the POI powerfully or didn't have time to answer it? Should we answer it?
Okay, so the question is, if you're the deputy leader of the opposition and the leader of the opposition is offered a POI and I assume accepts it but doesn't have time to answer it, what should you do?
Yeah.
So general things about POIs, you should be accepting at least one, probably two, no matter what speaker you are in the debate. If you accept a question and it's asked to you, you have to answer it. There's no such thing as not having enough time to answer a question. If you've taken the time out of your speech to accept a question, you should give it the 15, 20, or 25 seconds it requires to answer it. This is not an optional portion of British parliamentary debate, it's absolutely fundamental.
What if the leader of the opposition didn't answer it powerfully?
Okay, they didn't answer it well. Yeah, I mean, this is a very common situation, I think. Sometimes you're speaking and you get a question and you can't really think of a good answer to it, so you offer one that's maybe not the best possible answer. In that situation, as the deputy leader of the opposition, it would be appropriate for you to try to reinforce that answer. So maybe as part of your reconstruction, in that part of your speech, you could say, you know, my partner made this argument, he was asked this question, he said this. Well, here are 3 more responses to that question. Your role as the deputy leader, in a lot of ways, as Josh was saying, similarly with the deputy prime minister, you're wanting to reinforce your partner. You are bringing new substantive material, but a lot of your job is to prop up what your partner's done, and so that very much fits into that.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, what's the most effective way to prepare during the 30 minutes prepare time?
Sure, that's a big question. How do you prepare as the opening opposition? As I said a bit before, this is the position that requires some of the most flexibility in the debate. So a lot of your preparation is going to involve thinking about what you think the opening government's going to do and all the possible permutations of what they could do. So not just what's the most likely way of running this as the government, what's the most reasonable model, but what else could they actually do? Thinking about what they might say, and then in response to that, what's our case? How do you counter that? So you have to come up with lots of different sets of arguments. You're not just going to come up with one group of 4 arguments, you might have to come up with like 3 or 4 groups of multiple arguments to counter different possible cases. That's tricky, but it means that in the debate you can be much more flexible than if you've just prepared one possible opposition to the debate. So I guess this is sort of not very useful and sort of flippant advice, but do a lot of brainstorming with your partner. Use your printed materials. Use your tutor. These are things that not all styles of debate allow for. I really wish when I was debating I could have used my coach. Take advantage of the fact that you have that as a resource, and that you have half an hour. It's a lot of time.
We are past 11 o'clock now. I want to say thanks again to Jess for her discussion about the opening opposition. Remember that we have a lunch break now until 12:30. We will reconvene here to talk about the latter positions in the debate this afternoon, and then eventually this afternoon we'll get you into some practice rounds. So enjoy your lunch break. I'll see you back here in an hour and a half. No, it's okay. Obviously lots of
Yes, you can.
Did you say you were going to provide all the PowerPoints?
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we can...
No, he was asking if he could get a copy.
It's a lot easier. We'll put them on the website within a couple of days, so probably the easiest way to do it.
So we have that PowerPoint, all the slides show that.
Yeah, we're going to put all the PowerPoints available on the website. So.
Yay! Thanks, Steve.
All right, at some point we need to figure out who's doing what.
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that right now.
Sure. Do you want me to boot up my laptop and you can see what I have down?
Do that while we're eating?
Yeah, we can do that while we eat.
Is that okay?
the way not to prepare a lecture that's joint?
I'm good.
Did anybody turn this off? Oh, great.
This morning the first feedback.
So,